Okay, so I was coming across this. I came across this on Facebook, and I just want to get this out to as many people as I can. Um, I know as of right now, I have no followers, but hopefully, sometime soon, sooner or later, somebody might come across this video. I will not play America's Army while this video runs. As I put in the description, the audio you will hear, or I will read this from an excerpt from American Military News. The the catalog says I've taken this off of. Sorry, I might get shit for this. In fact, knowing how the world is, I will get shit for this. But you know what? I don't care. As long as you're listening to every name that is read aloud, I don't care how much shit I get for this. There's a saying that all gave some, and some gave all. This is to the some. This is to the few that gave all. So, just so you know, this video lasts about 4 hours. Here you go.
Good morning, everybody. If you were with us earlier, apologize for the breakup in the names, but we're back. And as we mentioned before, Memorial Day is upon us, and a lot of people will barbecue and have a good time. But the one thing about Memorial Day that we always try to remember is that it's about our fallen brothers and sisters that did not make it back like we did. So we celebrate their lives, we remember them. There is 6,774 individuals that were KIA in OEF and OIF. So today we're going to remember every single one of them. All 6,774. This is half the list right here, front and back. So we're going to be doing this in shifts, and thank you for tuning in. And we're going to kick it off with Derek over here, and we're gonna work our way through. So bear with us, and remember your fallen brothers and sisters on this Memorial Day weekend.
Hello, Derek Ladner, former Sergeant, U.S. Army. I remember today Lieutenant Andrew Basevich, Delta Company 38 Cav. Bullet tankers, I'm wearing my tanker shirt for this today. Specialist Aaron Amat. Specialist Sergio Abad. Sergeant Matthew Abate. Sergeant Christopher Abeta. Staff Sergeant Omar Acevez. Specialist Edward Acosta. Specialist Rudy Acosta. Captain Clayton Adam Cavicius. Specialist Christian Adams. Master Sergeant Daniel Adams. Sergeant Ryan Adams. Staff Sergeant Frank Adamski. Sergeant First Class Charles Adkins. Specialist Trevor Adkins. Staff Sergeant Vincent Atkinson. Staff Sergeant Francisco Aguila. Sergeant Amaru Aguilar. Sergeant Eugene Aguan. Specialist Shane Ahmed. Staff Sergeant Jesse Ainsworth. Sergeant Kevin Akins. Sergeant Major Philip Albert. Sergeant Raymond Alcaraz. Senior Airman Nicholas Alden. Specialist Erica Alexson. Sergeant Nicholas Ailman. Staff Sergeant Leroy Alexander. Second Lieutenant Tobias Alexander. Sergeant Justin Allen. Staff Sergeant Nicole Allen. PFC Thomas Allers. Chief Warrant Officer Christopher Algayer. Sergeant Thomas Allison. Specialist Ember Alt. Staff Sergeant Joseph Altman. Specialist Kenneth Alvarez. Major Philip Abard. Staff Sergeant Matthew Amarin. Men. Lieutenant Jeffrey Amon. Sergeant Jason Amores. Staff Sergeant Canner Amper. Corporal William Amundsen. Specialist Mabry Anders. PV2 Billy Anderson. Specialist Brian Anderson. Specialist Mark Anderson. Lance Corporal Nicholas Anderson. PFC John Andrade. Second Lieutenant Darren Andrews. Master Sergeant Evader Andrews. Specialist Scott Andrews. Sergeant Daniel Angus. Staff Sergeant Christopher Antonic. PFC Carlos Aparicio. Sergeant First Class Martin Apollinaire. Lance Corporal Carlos Aragon. Captain Tamara Archuleta. Lance Corporal James Argentine. Sergeant Jan Argonish. Staff Sergeant Mark Ares Mendez. Sergeant First Class Afrin Arachanga. Corporal Rafael Aruda. Sergeant Joshua Ashley. Staff Sergeant Vincent Ashlock. Sergeant Paul Atim. Sergeant Bradley Atwell. Major Jeffrey Osborne. PFC Allen Austin. PFC Barrett Austin. Petty Officer 2 Matthew Alexson. Chief Warrant Officer 2 David Ayala. Corporal Jonathan Ayers. Sergeant James Ayube. Lance Corporal Travis Babine. PFC Brian Backus. Specialist David Batty. Staff Sergeant Charlie Bagwell. Corporal Michael Bailey. PV2 Michael Bailey. PFC Cody Baker. Lance Corporal David Baker. Sergeant First Class Jeffrey Baker. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Baldwin. Sergeant Kevin Baldoff. Master Sergeant Scott Ball. Chief Warrant Officer Edward Bali, Lance Corporal Christopher Balthazar, Sergeant Jesse Balthazar, Captain Matthew Bancroft, Sergeant Major Barbalian Banks, Master Sergeant George Boehner, Lance Corporal Pedro Barboza Flores, Lance Corporal Jason Barfield, Staff Sergeant Shane Barnard, Major Rocco Barnes, Command Sergeant Major Martin Barreras, Captain Brandon Barrett, Sergeant Robert Barrett, Sergeant Michael Berry, Staff Sergeant Justice Bartelt, Captain Daniel Bartel, Specialist Christopher Barton, First Sergeant Robert Barton, Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bars, Lieutenant Corporal Jordan Bastian, Corporal John Luke Bateman, PFC Brian Bates, Specialist John Batista, Specialist Rayvon Battle, Specialist Joseph Bauer, Major Larry Bogus, Staff Sergeant Tane Baum, Staff Sergeant Ryan Bauman, Corporal Taylor Bonnet, Staff Sergeant Thomas Basur, Sergeant Lucas Beechnow, Sergeant First Class John Beal, Staff Sergeant Jordan Bear, Sergeant Bobby Beasley, Petty Officer 2 Clayton Beauchamp, Sergeant Michael Beckerman, Specialist Gennaro Bedoy, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Belkofer, Senior Airman Brian Bell, Sergeant Christopher Bell, Sergeant Jerome Bell, First Sergeant Russell Bell, Staff Sergeant Vincent Bell, PFC Joseph Belmontes, Staff Sergeant Carlos Benitez, Master Sergeant Adam Benjamin, First Lieutenant Robert Benenson, Sergeant Alexander Bennett, Lance Corporal Daniel Bennett, Staff Sergeant Kenneth Bennett, Chief Petty Officer Derek Benson, Specialist Keith Benson, Petty Officer 2 Matthew Bergman, Specialist Julian Beresford, Staff Sergeant Brian Berkey, Lance Corporal Joshua Bernard, Specialist Nicholas Bernier, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Berrettini, Staff Sergeant Richard Berry, PFC Matthew Bertolini, Lance Corporal Brian Bertrand, Specialist Corey Bertrand, Staff Sergeant Jeremy Bessa, Sergeant Raphael Begay Bays, Chief Petty Officer Brian Bill, Chief Warrant Officer 2 Randy Billings, Sergeant Robert Billings, PFC Tremaine Billingsley, Lance Corporal Joshua Birchford, Staff Sergeant Christopher Birdwell, Corporal John Bishop, Staff Sergeant Keith Bishop, Master Sergeant Benjamin Bittner, First Sergeant John Blair, PV2 Blake, Sergeant Jesse Blamirez, Captain Aaron Blanchard, Sergeant Joshua Blaney, Sergeant Aaron Blaisio, Sergeant First Class Matthew Blakowski. Sergeant Stephen Bless. Sergeant J. Blessing. Specialist William Blevins. PFC Cody Ford.
How you guys doing? Corporal Vasquez, United States Marine Corps. Today and every day I remember Lance Corporal James Bray Stack. Sergeant First Class Boatwright Alvin. Staff Sergeant Michael Bach. Sergeant Philip Box. Lance Corporal James Volk. Corporal Jason Bogar. Sergeant Thomas Bohall. Sergeant First Class Bradley Bold. Sergeant Peter Bowler. Sergeant Edward Bowen. Staff Sergeant Jeremy Border. Chief Petty Officer Raymond Border. Corporal Christopher Bordoni. Captain David Boris. Sergeant Federico Borjas. Sergeant Joshua Bourne. Major Thomas Bostic. Matthew Bourgeois. Sergeant Joseph Bovia. Staff Sergeant Joshua Bowden. Staff Sergeant Clayton Bowen. Sergeant First Class Colin Bowen. Master Sergeant Jamal Bowers. Staff Sergeant Timothy Bowles. Specialist Brian Bowman. Corporal Christopher Boyd. Private First Class Brian Bradbury. Captain Michael Braden. Sergeant Mark Bradley. First Lieutenant Brian Bradshaw. Specialist Michaela Bragg. Lance Corporal Randy Braggs. Captain John Brainerd. Petty Officer Second Class San Brazos. Sergeant Joshua Brennan. Lance Corporal Julian Brennan. Sergeant Brian Brewster. Specialist Francisco Breseno Alvarez. Staff Sergeant Andrew Britton Mahalo. Lance Corporal Billy Brixey. Private First Class Jordan Brochu. Major David Roger. Petty Officer First Class Michael Brodsky. Lance Corporal Matthew Brome. First Lieutenant Jonathan Rostam. Chief Petty Officer Adam Brown. Staff Sergeant Christopher Brown. Staff Sergeant Daniel Brown. Lance Corporal Jared Brown. Specialist Jeremy Brown. Tech Sergeant John Brown. PV2 Matthew Brown. Petty Officer First Class Milton Brown. Specialist Setteria LaFay Brown. Master Sergeant Tara Renice Brown. Sergeant William Brown. Sergeant First Class William Russell Brown. Staff Sergeant Charles Robert Browning. Lance Corporal Gavin Roderick Brumman. Master Sergeant Thomas Lee Bruner. Staff Sergeant Scott William Brunkhorst. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Deal Bryant Jr. Gunnery Sergeant Stephen Lehman Bryson. Staff Sergeant Andrew Stephen Bubax. Lance Corporal Gregory Thomas Buckley. Lance Corporal Arden Joseph Yanagua. Corporal Lauren Miles Buffalo. Sergeant Douglas Bull. Staff Sergeant James Bullard. Tech Sergeant Larry Bunn. Captain Brian Bunting. SRA Michael Burris. Staff Sergeant Brian Burgess. Staff Sergeant Scott Burgess. Staff Sergeant Jason Burkholder. Specialist Nicholas Burley. Agent Dustin Burnett. Specialist James Burnett. Corporal Antonio Burnside. Lance Corporal Dennis Burrow. Sergeant Brandon Burry. Specialist Serena Butcher. Sergeant Thomas Butler. Private First Class Brandon Buttry. Specialist James Butts. Specialist Justin Buxbaum. Corporal Adam Boyce. Sergeant Keith Buzinski. PFC Jordan Bird. Staff Sergeant Christopher Kabokoy. Staff Sergeant Eric Caban. Sergeant Michael Cable. Lieutenant Colonel David Cabrera. Sergeant William Caher. Corporal Justin Kane. Specialist Norman Kane. Major Jeffrey Calero. Sergeant Marvin Calhoun. Sergeant Sean Callahan. Corporal Isaiah Calloway. Sergeant Jason Kalo. Lance Corporal Christopher Camaro. Tech Sergeant Anthony Campbell. Chief Petty Officer Christopher Campbell. Staff Sergeant Damian Campbell. Specialist Joshua Campbell. Sergeant Carl Campbell. Specialist Gerardo Campos. Lance Corporal Dustin Canham. Petty Officer 3rd Class Mark Cannon. Private First Class Shane Cantu. Staff Sergeant Jose Manuel Carballo Pietri. Lieutenant Colonel Mario Carrazzo. Petty Officer 2nd Class Anthony Garbulido. Staff Sergeant Michael Cardenas. Specialist Kevin Cardoza. Specialist Daniel Carlson. Staff Sergeant Nicholas Carnes. Master Sergeant Scott Carney. Specialist Joseph Karen. Lance Corporal Andrew Carpenter. Specialist Jacob Carroll. Sergeant Patrick Carroll. Major Paul Caron. Corporal Nathan Cars. Sean, Petty Officer 1st Class Sean Carson. Specialist Curtis Carter. Chief Warrant Officer 4 David Carter. CW4 James Carter. Sergeant Cartwright. Corporal Jacob Carver. Lance Corporal Ross Carver. First Lieutenant Donald Carwile. Sergeant Nicholas Casey. PFC Justin Casillas. Sergeant Joseph Caskey. Lance Corporal Jesse Casada. HN Benjamin Castiglione. Specialist Andrew Castro. Sergeant John Castro. Sergeant First Class Michael Cathcart. Lance Corporal Alec Catherwood. Specialist Matthew Catlett. Specialist George Colley. Corporal Roberto Cazares. Specialist Joseph Brian Kemper. Lance Corporal Urban Ceniceros. Lance Corporal Rick Cantani. Specialist Richard Ceros. Sergeant First Class Victor Cervantes. Captain James Edward Chaffin. Sergeant David James Chambers. Specialist Christian Chandler. Captain Jeremy Chandler. Sergeant First Class Christopher Chaplow. Tech Sergeant John Chapman. Sergeant First Class Nathan Chapman. Specialist Robert Charlton. Petty Officer 3rd Class Andrew Charpenter. Corporal Philip Charte. Sergeant Julian Chase. Staff Sergeant Hyo Hyuk Che. Sergeant Stephen Checo. Chief Petty Officer Nicholas Check. PV2 Danny Chen. Staff Sergeant Craig Cherry. Specialist Shannon Chihuahua. Lance Corporal Cody Childers. Master Sergeant Gregory Childs. Staff Sergeant Roberto Chiomento. Private First Class Benjamin Chisholm. Lieutenant Florence Cho. Staff Sergeant James Kristen. Staff Sergeant Eric Damon Christian. Staff Sergeant Rusty Kristen. Lance Corporal Jordan Schrobit. Lance Corporal Dominic Sierra Mitaro. Captain Bruce Clark. Specialist Chaz Ray Clark. Sergeant Corey Clark. Lance Corporal Jeffrey Clark. Lance Corporal Philip Clark. Private First Class Ryan Clark. Gunnery Sergeant Theodore Clark. Lieutenant Colonel Todd Clark. Sergeant Joel Clarkson. First Sergeant Herbert Clunch. Specialist Hilda Clayton. Staff Sergeant John Cleaver. Specialist Brian Michael Clemens. Staff Sergeant Sean Michael Clemens. Specialist Chad Derek Clemens. Captain Richard Cliff. Lance Corporal Peter Clore. Corporal Justin Klaus. Staff Sergeant Jesse Clowers. Specialist Junot Cochillas. Lance Corporal Kenneth Cochran. Corporal Keaton Coffey. Corporal Christopher Coughlin. Staff Sergeant Walter Cohey. CW4 Brent Cole. Corporal Jeremiah Cole. Specialist Chad Coleman. Specialist Justin Coleman. Master Sergeant Mark Coleman. PFC Matthew Collin. Lance Corporal Jeremiah Collins. Sergeant Sean Martin Collins. PFC Julian Colvin. Staff Sergeant Casey Combs. Captain Kyle Comfort. Corporal Matthew Commons. Private First Class Paul Conlon. Major David Connolly. Sergeant Ryan Connolly. Sergeant Timothy Conrad. Specialist Coran Contreras. PFC Nicholas Cook. Specialist Robert Cook. Specialist Ryan Cook. Specialist Keenan Cooper. Corporal William Cooper. Staff Sergeant Gregory Copes. PFC Douglas Cordo. Tech Sergeant Sean Corlew. Sergeant First Class Clark Corley. First Lieutenant Salvatore Corma. Lance Corporal Kevin Cornelius. Corporal Bernard Corpus. Lance Corporal Joshua Coral. PFC Caesar Cortez. Lance Corporal Kenneth Corzine. Lance Corporal Niall Cortesiers. Sergeant Major Robert Cottle. Specialist Kyle Kumis. Corporal Peter Corsi. Private First Class Kyle Kotu. Staff Sergeant Robert Cowdrey. Corporal Daniel Cox. Staff Sergeant Nathan Cox. Sergeant Nathan Cox. Sergeant Adam Craig. Staff Sergeant Brian Craig. Staff Sergeant Heath Craig. Specialist Richard Crane. Lance Corporal Leighton Crass. Sergeant Zanaya Creamer. Sergeant Andrew Creighton. First Sergeant Jose Crisostomo. Sergeant Bradley Cross. PFC Peter Cross. Corporal William Kraus. Sergeant Robert Wayne Crow. Specialist Josiah Crumpler. Sergeant Aaron Cruttenden. Petty Officer Second Class Dominique Cruz. PFC Joseph Cruz. Corporal Kevin Cueto. Sergeant Justin Colbreth. Staff Sergeant Ari Colors. Staff Sergeant Joshua Cullens. Second Lieutenant Joe Cunningham. SRA Jason Cunningham. Staff Sergeant Joseph Guerreri. PFC Eric Dennis Courier. First Sergeant Michael Curry. Specialist Jonathan Curtis. Staff Sergeant Kurt Curtis. Specialist Sean Cutsworth. PFC Paul Kazupi. Captain Brandon Sire. Staff Sergeant Joseph DeAugustine. Mitchell Daling. Specialist Michael Dahl. Staff Sergeant Jason Dahlke. Corporal Leopold Damas. Captain Patrick Damon. Sergeant Devin Daniels. Lance Corporal Nicholas Daniels. Specialist Carrie Daniluk. Sergeant James Darrow. Specialist Adam Davis. MMFR Bryant Davis. Sergeant David Davis. Master Sergeant Jefferson Davis. Specialist Jonathan Davis. Staff Sergeant Jonathan Davis. Lance Corporal Joshua Davis. PFC Justin Davis. Specialist Nathan Davis. Sergeant Robert Davis. Staff Sergeant Timothy Davis. Sergeant Ezra Dawson. PFC William Dawson. Staff Sergeant David Day. Petty Officer First Class Jared Day. Staff Sergeant Edwin Daza-Chachin. Staff Sergeant Esua Ivan de la Peña Hernandez. Sergeant Fernando de la Rosa. Corporal Patrick David Deans. Dane DeBoer. Master Sergeant Coder DeBose. Specialist Mark DeCateau. Specialist Robert DeFazio. Master Sergeant Bernard Degan. First Lieutenant Dimitri Alejandro Del Castillo. Sergeant Stephen DeLuzio. Specialist Michael DeMarcico. Lance Corporal Anthony Denier. PFC Dennis Jacob. PV2 Jared Dennis. Corporal Preston Dennis. Sergeant Jeremy DePate. First Lieutenant Jeffrey DePrimo. PFC Leroy Durande. Sergeant Joshua Desforges. Captain Bruno Desolani. Private First Class Patrick DeVoe. PFC Victor Du. PFC Richard Du. First Lieutenant Nick. Sergeant Matthew DeYoung. Private First Class Era Daisy. Sergeant Roberto Diaz Boria. Sergeant Christopher Diaz. Corporal Isaac Diaz. Sergeant.
Fuck. Apologize for that.
Nicholas Dick Hutt. Staff Sergeant Scott Edward Dickinson. Staff Sergeant Adam Dickmeyer. Staff Sergeant Richard Andrew Dixon. PFC Jackie Lee Denier. Specialist Jesse Dietrich. Petty Officer Second Class Danny Dietz. Specialist Alan Dixis. Lance Corporal Anthony Delicio. Private First Class James Dillon. Specialist Joseph DeMock. Corporal Scott DeMond. Private First Class Michael Richard Dinterman. Private First Class John Dion. Specialist Jason Disney. Major Dwayne Dively. Staff Sergeant Edward Dixon. Private First Class Adam Doberiner. Staff Sergeant Thomas Dodds Dudley. Staff Sergeant John Doles. Staff Sergeant Patrick Dolphin. Sergeant First Class Christopher Domage. Corporal Alex Dominion. Corporal Max Donahue. Major Michael Donahue. CW2 Christopher Donaldson. Specialist Robert Donevsky. First Lieutenant William James Donnelly. Staff Sergeant James Doherty. The Officer First Class John Duangdara. Tech Sergeant Daniel Lee DeVille. Specialist Mark Downer. Specialist Christopher Drake. Private First Class David Drake. Sergeant David Draculich. Specialist Robert Eugene Draw. Private First Class Stephen Dries. Captain Brandon Dronette. Lance Corporal Curtis Duarte. Tech Sergeant Scott Duffman. Corporal Joshua Dumas. Sergeant Paul Edmund Dumont. Specialist Spencer Duncan. Lance Corporal Keelan Dunn. Staff Sergeant Stephen Dunning. Master Sergeant Kevin DuPont. Specialist Stephen DuPont. Sergeant Russell Durgin. Sergeant Patrick Durham. Corporal Ciara Durkin. Sergeant Sean Durkin. CW2 Michael Duskin. Corporal Mitchell Michael Dutcher. Sergeant James Dutton. Specialist Robert Diaz. Lance Corporal Edward Dykus. CW2 Scott Dyer. Gunny Christopher Eastman. PV2 James Evers. Petty Officer First Class Kevin Ebert. Gunny Christopher Eckert. Specialist Jason Edens. Sergeant Donald Edgerton. Private First Class Kevin Edgin. Specialist John Edmonds. Captain Daniel Eggers. Staff Sergeant Brandon Eggleston. CW2 Jody Agnor. SRA Nicholas Eischen. Staff Sergeant Gregory Ellum. Master Sergeant Igmigdio Elizares. Specialist Robert Ellis. Private First Class Vincent Ellis. Specialist Michael Elm. First Sergeant Kenneth Elwell. Specialist Richard Emmons. Staff Sergeant Jordan Emmerich. Corporal Zachary Ensley. Officer First Class Daryl Enos. Staff Sergeant Garrick Eppinger. Corporal Caleb Erickson. Staff Sergeant Michael Esposito. Corporal Keith Ezra. Sergeant Richard Essex. Major Raymond Estelle. Sergeant First Class Bobby Essel. Private First Class Jason Estopinal. Officer Third Class Kyler Estrada. Sergeant Carlo Eugenio. First Lieutenant Forrest Ewins. Second Lieutenant Jared Huey. Staff Sergeant Troy Ezernak. Chief Petty Officer John Fass. Lance Corporal Ralph Fabry. Sergeant First Class Jason Fabrizi. Specialist David Fahy. PFC Aaron Fairbairn. Staff Sergeant Christopher Falco. Staff Sergeant Joseph Fankhauser. Staff Sergeant Daniel Fannin. Sergeant Sean Fannin. Specialist Garrett Fant. Lance Corporal John Farias. First Lieutenant Daniel Farkas. Staff Sergeant Brandon Farley. Staff Sergeant Derek Farley. Sergeant Sean Farrell. Specialist Joshua Ferris. Sergeant Louis Festuca. PFC Jeremy Faulkner. Corporal Aaron Faust. First Lieutenant Matthew Fazzari. Master Sergeant Daniel Fetter. Petty Officer First Class Patrick Feeks. Major Curtis Feisner. Sergeant Gregory Fedran. Specialist Dustin Feldhaus. Sergeant Kelvin Feliciano Gutierrez. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Fenty. Sergeant Christopher Fernandez. Corporal Kyle Fernandez. Captain Matthew Ferrara. Lance Corporal Bruce Farrell. Specialist Aaron Fields. Sergeant First Class Robert Fike. Petty Officer First Class Vincent Philpy. Specialist Jason Fingar. Specialist James Finley. Specialist Eric Finningham. Staff Sergeant Jerome Furtamag. Captain Michael Fiskus. Sergeant Jackery Fisher. Specialist Crystal Fitz. PFC Patrick Fitzgibbon. Officer First Class Joseph Fitzmaurice. CW3 William Flanagan. Staff Sergeant Sean Flannery. Corporal Jacob Fleischer. First Lieutenant Scott Fleming. Corporal Gregory Fleury. Specialist Dwayne Flores. Specialist Jesus Flores. Tech Sergeant Michael Flores. CW3 John Flynn. Staff Sergeant Thomas Fogarty. Chief Petty Officer Jack Fontan. Staff Sergeant Ryan Foraker. Sergeant First Class Omar Ford. Sergeant James Fordyce. SRA Mark Forrester. Specialist Stephen Fortunato. Sergeant Jeremy Foshi. Lance Corporal Christopher Folks. Sergeant Dylan Fox. Corporal Dale Fracker. Corporal David Fraze. Officer Third Class John Fralish. Staff Sergeant Gregory Frampton. Lance Corporal Alberto Franciscani. Sergeant Frank Edward. PFC Benny Franklin. Sergeant Daniel Fraser. Staff Sergeant Jacob Lee Fraser. Staff Sergeant Nicholas Fretzty. Corporal Daniel Freeman. Sergeant Jamil Freeman. Captain Matthew Freeman. Lance Corporal Michael Freeman. Lance Corporal Ronald Freeman. Chief Petty Officer Jason Freeman. Staff Sergeant Alex French. First Lieutenant Demetrius Frison. Staff Sergeant Carrie Frith. Staff Sergeant William Fritsch. Sergeant Chad Froker. Staff Sergeant Joseph Fierst. Sergeant First Class Michael Fuga. Specialist Chad Fuller. Staff Sergeant Michael Gable. Corporal Charles Gaffney. Sergeant Christopher Gailey. Specialist Vilmar Galarza Hernandez. Staff Sergeant Justin Galuski. Staff Sergeant Justin Gallegos. H.N. Riley Gallagher Long. Sergeant Daniel Galvan. Lance Corporal Garrett Gamble. PFC Vincent Gamone. Corporal Brandon Garabrand. Master Chief Petty Officer Jeffrey Garber. Specialist Ryan Garbs. H.N. Anthony Garcia. Sergeant Israel Garcia. PV2 Jair Garcia. Staff Sergeant Michael Garcia. Captain Mark Garner. Sergeant Joseph Garrison. Specialist Ryan Gartner. Sergeant Corey Garver. Specialist Nathaniel Garvin. PFC Damian Garza. Corporal Rogelio Garza. Staff Sergeant Gerard Gass. Private First Class Jacob Gasson. A1C Austin Gates Benson. Specialist Christopher Gathercole. CW2 Bradley Goddard. Lance Corporal Daniel Geary. Lance Corporal Michael Geary. Sergeant Christopher Geiger. Sergeant Ian Gellig. First Lieutenant Joel Gens. Specialist Matthew George. Lance Corporal Philip George. Staff Sergeant Scott Gurmison. CW3 Thomas Gibbons. CWO 3 Jonathan Gibson. PFC Nicholas Gideon. Lance Corporal Geese. Gunnery Sergeant Jonathan Gifford. Gunnery Sergeant Robert Gilbert. Specialist William Gilbert. Sergeant Carlos Gill. Master Sergeant Randy Gillespie. Sergeant Benjamin Gilman. Tech Sergeant Adam Gannett. Second Lieutenant Michael Giordano. Staff Sergeant Joshua Sepp. Specialist Theodore Matthew Lundy. We are still on OEF. My name is Steve Sebi, United States Marine Corps. Was attached to 1-3 as a combat camera in 2004 in Fallujah. So I'm remembering Sergeant Rafael Peralta. So, G's in OEF. Staff Sergeant Seamus Gore. First Lieutenant Christopher Goki. Captain Dale Getz. Sergeant Nicholas Golding. Sergeant First Class Wyatt Goldsmith. Sergeant Jonathan Golnitz. Corporal Billy Gomez. PFC Ethan Goncalo. Sergeant First Class Chad Gonsalves. Sergeant Aiden Gonzalez. PV2 Joseph Gonzalez. HN Edwin Gonzalez. If I screw up any ranks, it's because I'm a Marine and I don't know all the other branches that well, and I'm sorry. And if I screw up any names, also, I'm sorry, no disrespect intended. Sergeant Jamie Gonzalez. Sergeant First Class Luis Gonzalez. Sergeant Moises Gonzalez. Sergeant Rodrigo Gonzalez Garza. Staff Sergeant Araceli Gonzalez O'Malley. Specialist Gary Lee Jr. Gooch. SRA Alicia Sabrina Good. Corporal Jordan ML Good. PFC Brandon Dwayne Gooding. Corporal Nathan Joel Goodiron. SRA Ashton Lynn Marie Goodman. CW3 Corey James Goodnature. Staff Sergeant Robert Stacy Goodwin. Specialist Brandon Drew Gordon. Specialist Brittany Bria Gordon. Sergeant Robert David Gordon. Specialist Terry Kashawn Gordon. PFC Brian Lee Gorham. Sergeant Brett Edward Gornowitz. Sergeant Marcos Antonio Gora. Sergeant Christopher James Gould. Corporal Mark Raymond Goyette. Sergeant Edward Savvy Grace. Specialist Keith Aaron Jr. Grace. SN Katrina Renee Grady. Specialist Ryan John Grady. Specialist Kevin James Graham. Captain Thomas Joseph Gramath. Sergeant First Class Alejandro Renato III. Lance Corporal Christopher O'Brien Grant. PSC Joshua Allen Gray. Major Walter David Gray. Sergeant Anthony Gabriel Green. Specialist Douglas J. Green. Major Michael Lee Green. Staff Sergeant Stacy Andrew Green. Major Harold Joseph Green. Sergeant Jeremy Richard Green. Corporal Christopher Daniel Greer. Lance Corporal Robert Stephen Greniger. Sergeant First Class Ronald Aaron Reiter. Staff Sergeant Kevin Douglas Greco. Specialist Jarrett Pearson Grimmel. Sergeant Christopher Todd Griffin. Sergeant Dale Russell Griffin. CSM Kevin James Griffin, Lance Corporal Tyler Owen Griffin, Sergeant John Cripe Griffith, Major Samuel Mark Griffith, Staff Sergeant Jesse James Grindley, Corporal Aaron Matthew Griner, Sergeant First Class James Floyd Grissom, Staff Sergeant Casey James Grachowiak, CW2 Travis Wayne Grogan, PFC Dustin Dean Gross, Corporal Frank Robert Gross, Sergeant William Benjamin Gross Panaguia, CW3 James Edison Groves III, Staff Sergeant Raul Madrigal Guerra, Sergeant Michael James Guillory, Corporal Jeremy Raymond Gillett, Sergeant Daniel David Gurr, Specialist Augustin Gutierrez, Staff Sergeant David Hector Gutierrez, Specialist Stephen Edward Gutowski, Corporal Christian Armando Guzman, Sergeant Gabriel Guzman, Sergeant Brandon Eugene Hadaway, Lance Corporal Roger Gary Michael Hager, Major Scott Allen Haggerty, Sergeant First Class Samuel Carlos Hairston, First Lieutenant Benjamin John Hall, Specialist Blake Wade Hall, Specialist David Eugene Hall, Lance Corporal David Ray Hall, Staff Sergeant Jeffrey Allen Hall, PFC Jonathan David Hall, Captain Ryan Preston Hall, Captain John Louis Hallett III, Staff Sergeant Patrick Douglas Hamburger, Specialist Adam Scott Hamilton, Specialist Donald Antoine Hamilton Jr., Staff Sergeant Carl Eric Hammer, Staff Sergeant Joseph John Hansky, Specialist Kimball Andrus Hand, Specialist Andrew Lee Hand, Lance Corporal Nicholas Joel Hand, Staff Sergeant Randy Michael Haney, Master Sergeant Sean Thomas Hannon, Staff Sergeant Daniel Lewis Hanson, Staff Sergeant Dennis Joe Hanson, Staff Sergeant John Eric Hanson, Sergeant Justin Michael Hanson, Lance Corporal Matthias Newman Hanson, Sergeant Ethan Carroll Hardin, Sergeant Jeremy Franklin Hardison, Specialist Adam Jeffrey Hart, Sergeant Joshua Mitchell Hart, Staff Sergeant Zachary Hayden Hargrove, PFC Eric William Hario, Staff Sergeant Willie James Jr. Harley, Sergeant Matthew Allen Harmon, PFC Andrew Martin Harper, Lance Corporal Scott Daniel Harper, CW2 Stanley Lorne Harriman, PFC Devin Jamel Harris, PFC Joseph Graham Harris, PO1 Joshua Thomas Harris, Sergeant Joshua William Harris, Corporal Larry Donald Jr. Harris, Sergeant Tarion Travanti Harris, Sergeant First Class Todd Monroe Harris, Sergeant First Class Calvin Bernard Harrison, Colonel James Warren Harrison Jr., Staff Sergeant Bradley Charles Hart, Sergeant First Class David James Hartman, Corporal Joshua Alexander Hartman, Staff Sergeant Andrew William Harvey, Sergeant James William Harvey II, PFC Jason Daniel Hasnauer, Staff Sergeant William Earl Hassenflug, Master Sergeant Jerome David Hatfield, Sergeant Patrick Christopher Hawkins, Master Sergeant John Eric Hayes, Captain Bruce Evan Hayes, Sergeant Nathan Paul Hayes, SCPO Daniel Richard Healy, Sergeant James Caleb Healy, Lance Corporal Randy Michael Heck, Sergeant Michael Wayne Heed, Lance Corporal Sean Patrick Hefner, Specialist Justin Ryan Helton, Specialist Kyle Matthew Hellmauer, Sergeant First Class Aaron Arthur Henderson. CW2, Brian James Henderson. Sergeant First Class Christopher Dale Henderson. PV2, John Mackenzie Jr. Henderson Jr. Sergeant First Class John Michael Hennig. Sergeant Matthew Robert Hennigan. Specialist Nicholas Charlie Hensley. Specialist Russell Shane Hercules Jr. Staff Sergeant Edgar Alberto Heredia. Staff Sergeant Matthew Daniel Hermanson. Sergeant Ken King Hermogenem. Sergeant Josue Emin Hernandez Chavez. Specialist Alex Hernandez III. Lance Corporal Derek Hernandez. Sergeant Edelman Leonardo Hernandez. Corporal Emmanuel Hernandez. Lance Corporal Jose Alonso Hernandez. Corporal Joseph Michael Hernandez. Specialist Robert Antonio Hernandez Jr. Staff Sergeant Octavio Herrera. Sergeant Pernell Johnny Herrera. Sergeant First Class Rocky H. Herrera. Sergeant Brett Michael Hershey. Sergeant Edward Ralph Heselton. Specialist David Allen Hess. Sergeant Jacob Michael Hess. First Lieutenant Robert Joseph Hess. Specialist Julie Rochelle Hickey. Sergeant First Class Jason Omar Bradley Hickman. Sergeant Channing Bo Hicks. Corporal Darian Terrell Hicks. Sergeant Jamar Avery Hicks. Staff Sergeant Jason Carlisle Hicks. Darren Miguel Hidalgo, First Lieutenant. Sergeant David Michael Herholzer. Master Sergeant Michael Thomas Heister. Sergeant Anton Chassain Height. Sergeant Tanner Stone Higgins. PV2 Charles Milton High IV. Sergeant Stephen Carell High. Sergeant Adrian Edward Hike. Specialist Kevin Joseph Hilleman. Brigadier General Terrence John Hillman. Lance Corporal Jason Daniel Hill. Specialist Joshua Lee Hill. Specialist Kevin Olson Hill. Sergeant Sean Fitzgerald Hill. Sergeant First Class Matthew Lee Hill. First Lieutenant Derek Stephen Hines. Specialist Rudolph Ryan Heisen. Staff Sergeant Brian Scott Hobbs. Lance Corporal Donald James Hogan. Lance Corporal Hunter Dalton Hogan. Captain Jason Ellis Holbrook. PFC Kyle Matthew Holder. Specialist Derek David Holland. Gunnery Sergeant Lloyd Earl Courtney Holly. Staff Sergeant Eric Scott Holman. Sergeant David Alexander Holmes. Sergeant Tyler Nicholas Holtz. Specialist Christopher Stephen Honecker. Lance Corporal Terry Edward Jr. Honeycutt Jr. Sergeant First Class Brian Allen Huber. Tech Sergeant James Robert Hornbarger. Specialist Patricia Lee Horn. PFC Christopher Alexander Horns. CW3 Brian Daniel Hornsby. Specialist Justin Lewis Horsley. Specialist Christopher David Horton. Staff Sergeant Michael Wesley Hosey. Sergeant Chester Wayne Hoseberg. Sergeant J. Michael Hoskins. PFC Jonathan Michael Dean Hostetter. PFC Gunner Randall Hodgkin. CPO Kevin Arthur Houston. Corporal Jason Dane Hogater. Lance Corporal Abram LaRue Howard. Sergeant Rice Daniel Howard. Sergeant First Class Meredith Lee Howard. Staff Sergeant Christopher Thomas Howick. Sergeant Christopher Richard Hirbeck. Lance Corporal Mong Thu Tyke. Sergeant First Class Bradley Scott Hughes. Specialist Buddy James Huey. Sergeant John Patrick Hewling. Staff Sergeant Travis Kent Hunsberger. Staff Sergeant James Patrick Hunter. Specialist Terry John Hearn. Master Sergeant David G. Hurt, Lance Corporal Dakota Ray Hughes, Specialist Matthew David Houston, Corporal Andrew Lewis Hutchins, First Lieutenant Josh Michael Highland, Captain Ryan Kenneth Yeleni, PFC Jose Ibarra, Staff Sergeant James Roger Ide, Captain Francis D. Imlay Jr., Staff Sergeant Jesse Infante, Staff Sergeant Matthew Nevin Ingham, Sergeant Matthew Lee Ingram, Sergeant Michael Keith Jr. Ingram, Sergeant Brett Daniel Eisenhower, Sergeant Brandon Tyler Isla, Captain Aaron Dale Astry, Lance Corporal Francisco Raphael Jackson, Sergeant Isaac Brandon Jackson, Lance Corporal Joe Michael Jackson, Sergeant First Class Mark Wayne Jackson, Lance Corporal Timothy Matthew Jackson, Sergeant Wakuna Amira Jackson, Specialist Keith Lamont Jacobs Jr., First Lieutenant Sean Robert Jacobs, Sergeant Kip Allen Jacoby, EMFA Michael Jamal Jakes Jr., CSM Dennis Jr. Jala, Specialist Dennis Jr. James, Staff Sergeant Errol Melvin James, PO2 Laquit Pate James, Corporal Michael Douglas Jankowitz, Staff Sergeant Jamie Darrell Jarbo, Sergeant First Class John Haskell Jarrell, Sergeant First Class Barry Edward Jarvis, PFC Conrado Diaz Jr. Javier, Specialist Ryan Paul Jane, PFC David Anthony Jefferson, Tech Sergeant William Haywood Jr. Jefferson, Specialist Douglas J. Jr. Jeffries, Specialist Joseph Allen Jeffries, Captain Corey J. Jenkins, Specialist Jared Robert Jenkins, Major Kevin Michael Genretti, Specialist Dennis Gregory Jensen, Gunnery Sergeant Ryan Jecky, PFC Joshua Lynn Jett, Specialist Charles Scott Jurtle, PFC Jason Douglas Johns, Sergeant First Class Alan Cornelius Johnson, PO3 Benjamin Allen Johnson, SRA Daniel James Johnson, First Lieutenant David Andrew Johnson, Staff Sergeant Donna Ray Johnson, Gunnery Sergeant Edwin Wayne Johnson Jr., Specialist Isaac Lee Johnson Jr., Corporal Jeffrey Warren Johnson, PFC John Corley Johnson, Sergeant Joseph Dennis Johnson, Staff Sergeant Justin Brassard Johnson Sr., PFC Kalen Christopher Lee Johnson, Lance Corporal Larry Michael Johnson, Specialist Matthew James Johnson, First Lieutenant Michael Edward Johnson, CW2 Nicholas Scott Johnson, Lance Corporal Raymond Lee Allen Johnson, PO1 Stacy Aurelia Johnson, Specialist Timothy Lamar Johnson, Sergeant Trevon Travis Johnson, Sergeant Trevor Jeremiah Johnson, Specialist Jason Michael Johnston, Corporal Adam Douglas Jones, PO2 Darrell Ray Jr. Jones, Captain Eric Alton Jones, Captain Jason Benjamin Jones, Lieutenant Commander Landon Lee Jones, Sergeant Omar Alejandro Jones, Specialist Peyton Alexander Jones, PFC Richard Kelvin Jones, Sergeant Ricky Dwayne Jones, Sergeant Jeffrey William Jordan, Lance Corporal Kevin Boyd Joyce, Lance Corporal Mark David Juarez, Sergeant Tyler Austin Juden, PFC Anthony T. Justison, Staff Sergeant James Allen Justice, Specialist James Austin Justice, Sergeant First Class Matthew Ryan Kaler, Lance Corporal Ramon Taisakan Kaipat. Commander Christopher Edward Califut, Sergeant Dennis Edward Chancellor, Lance Corporal Jeremy Mitchell Kane. PO2 Matthew Jeffrey Cantor, Sergeant Christopher Neil Karch, Corporal Jason Anthony Carell, Sergeant Robert Paul Casson, Specialist Christopher M. Katzenberger, Staff Sergeant Jeremy Andrew Katzenberger, Sergeant James Charles Kearney III, Captain Benjamin David Keating, PSC Andrew James Keller, Sergeant Michael Jason Kelly, Staff Sergeant Nigel David Kelly, First Lieutenant Robert Michael Kelly, Lieutenant Commander Jonas B. Kelsall, Gunnery Sergeant Aaron Michael Kennefic, Specialist Joseph Allen Kennedy, Sergeant Nathan Patrick Kennedy, Major Thomas Elliott Kennedy, Specialist Kurt William Kern, Master Sergeant William Joe Kerwood, Staff Sergeant Kevin James Kessler, MCPO Richard James Kessler Jr., Sergeant First Class Jeffrey Dwayne Kettle, PFC John Francis Kim, Lieutenant Colonel Paul Wayne Kimbrough, PFC Brandon Michael King, Corporal Jared Lee King, Specialist Ryan Charles King, Specialist Adam Gareth Kinser, Sergeant Joshua John Kirk, Sergeant Michael Dana Kerspel Jr., Corporal Brandon Michael Curtin, Corporal Nicholas Kane Curtin, Staff Sergeant Daniel Leon Kisling, Staff Sergeant Dennis Delvin Kisloff, Sergeant Charles Bernard Kitowski III, Corporal Chris K. Kleinwatcher, Sergeant Eric Justin Klusek, Sergeant Michael Joseph Knapp, Specialist Marquis Irving Knight, Sergeant Jabron Stephen Knox, Captain Sarah Marie Knudsen, Corporal Stephen Robert Cope, Sergeant Edward William Kohler III, Staff Sergeant Shane Marion Kell, Corporal Benjamin Stephen Cope, Staff Sergeant Noah Mark Corte, Specialist Corey Joseph Cowell, Sergeant Aaron Keith Kramer, CW2 Suresh Naranjan Kraus, Specialist Tyler Richard Crines, Corporal Dale Justin Creedlow, PFC Andrew Mark Kribner, Lieutenant Commander Eric Samuel Christensen, PFC Jason Michael Kropat, PFC Serge Kropov, Sergeant Ronald Allen Kubik, Specialist Adam Michael Kulgowski, Staff Sergeant Patrick Francis Kuchbak, CSM John Keith Laborde, Sergeant First Class William Kelly Lacey, SM Sergeant James Bertrand Lackey, Staff Sergeant Anthony Santos Lagman, Specialist Jared Allen Lallier, Sergeant Donald James Lamar Jr., First Lieutenant Todd William Lamka, Staff Sergeant Michael Scott Lammerts, Specialist Joshua Traven Lancaster, Specialist Joseph Michael Lancour, Corporal Brett Willie Land, Specialist Christopher Andrew Landis, First Lieutenant Brandon James Landrum, Sergeant First Class Mitchell Arthur Lane, Staff Sergeant Randall Ray Lane, Sergeant Ryan H. Lane, Corporal Sean Kane Aldrich Langevin, SCPO Louis James Langlegs, PFC Ira Benjamin Lanningham IV, Lance Corporal Samuel Wayne Jr. Large, POC Ryan Jeffrey Larson, Lance Corporal Jeremy Scott Lasher, Corporal Jacob Latour, Captain Joshua Sean Lawrence, Specialist Daniel Courtney Lawson, Staff Sergeant Eric Timothy Lawson Sr., Captain Garrett Tucker Law, Specialist Patrick Lewis Lay. I'll go through this and then hand it to you. James Ray Layton, PO3, Staff Sergeant Matthew John Leach, First Lieutenant Ivan Derek Leachowicz, Sergeant Charlie Madison Lee III, Staff Sergeant Daniel Tyler Lee, Staff Sergeant Dick Olson Lee Jr., Sergeant James Sean Lee, Specialist Jinsu Lee, Specialist Roger Lee, First Lieutenant Damon Thomas Liam, Sergeant First Class Matthew Ivan Leggett, Specialist Michael Robert Lay Miller, Corporal Jacob Call Lake, Sergeant David Lee Limbach, Specialist Erica Daniel Limke, Corporal Matthew Ryan Limke, Sergeant Joshua Allen Langsdorff, Sergeant Brian Stephen Leon Guerrero, Lieutenant Colonel Jamie Elizabeth Leonard, Sergeant Brian Jeffrey Linhart, Sergeant Donnie Leo Ford, Lance Corporal Christopher Phoenix Jacob Levy. Mo? Handing it off. Still in OEF.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Monica Vasquez. I was a former United States Navy sailor. I was quartermaster, petty officer, 3rd class. Here we go. Lance Corporal Harry Liu, Captain Daryl Cornelius Lewis, Specialist Joseph Michael Lewis, Staff Sergeant Lex Lee Lewis, Corporal Timothy Dale Lewis, Staff Sergeant Roy Lou Sutter, Specialist George Libby, Specialist Anthony Lightfoot, Second Lieutenant Stuart Lyles, Specialist Nathan Lillard, Master Sergeant Arthur Lilly, Sergeant Joseph Lilly, Sergeant Daniel Lynn, Sergeant Darren Lynn, Major Robert Lindow, Staff Sergeant Nathaniel Lindsay, Specialist Jameson Linskog, Staff Sergeant Eric Lindstrom, Corporal Daniel Linnaberry, Specialist Kevin Lapari, Staff Sergeant Andrew Labosco, Staff Sergeant Todd Labreco, Lieutenant Colonel Gwendolyn Locke, Staff Sergeant Roberto Loza, Lieutenant Colonel John Loftus, Corporal Joseph Logan, Sergeant Yobert Loney, Staff Sergeant Christian Longsworth, Sergeant Andrew Looney, Lieutenant Brandon Looney, Specialist Angel Lopez, Private First Class Jesus Lopez, Lance Corporal Joseph Lopez, Private First Class Ruben Lopez, Lance Corporal Juan Lopez Castaneda, Staff Sergeant Eduardo Loredo, Staff Sergeant Christopherson Lorenzo, Petty Officer First Class Raymond Lozano, Private First Class Zachary Lovejoy, Corporal Jamie Lowe, Specialist Jacob Lowell, Corporal Connor Laurie, Corporal Jason Lucas, Petty Officer First Class Jeffrey Lucas, Staff Sergeant Leon Lucas, Captain Ronald Luch, Sergeant Martin Lugo, Sergeant Joshua Lucala, Specialist Ryan Lumley, Petty Officer Second Class Brian Keith Lundy, Specialist Jonathan Lucier, David Lutz, Corporal Bryant Luxmore, Staff Sergeant Patrick Liebert, Lance Corporal Scott Lynch, Sergeant Terry Lynch, Captain David Lyon, Sergeant David Lyons, Chief Warrant Officer 3rd Class Niall Lyons, Specialist Stephen Mace, Captain Bruce McFarland, Sergeant Herman Mackey, Sergeant Thomas Macpherson, Specialist Russell Madden, Sergeant Anthony Maddox,
Sergeant Nicholas Dick Hutt, Staff Sergeant Scott Edward,
SCPO John Markham,
I apologize.
Private 2 Giovanni Maria, Corporal Donald Marler, Staff Sergeant Justin Marquez, Specialist Christopher Marquise, Specialist Chase Marta, Specialist Ethan Martin, Staff Sergeant Jack Martin, Lance Corporal Shane Martin, Staff Sergeant Vernon Martin, Specialist Wyatt Martin, Private 1st Class Matthew Martinek, Corporal Alex Martinez, Sergeant Rafael Jr. Martinez, Chief Petty Officer Matthew Mason, Staff Sergeant Robert Marcelli, Corporal Connor Masterson, Master Sergeant Edwin Cologne, Sergeant Anthony Mattioni, Private 1st Class John Maddox, Sergeant Jamie Maugans, Sergeant Eric May, Sergeant Kenneth May, Specialist Thomas Mayberry, Staff Sergeant Chauncey Mays, Petty Officer 1st Class Alex Mazer, Chief Warrant Officer Andrew McAdams, Staff Sergeant Kenneth McCanich, Specialist 1st Class Jonathan McCain, Chief Warrant Officer Herschel McCants, Sergeant Charles McLean, Sergeant Kyle McLean, Chief Warrant Officer Jonah McCullen, Private 1st Class Daniel McClenny, Captain Joshua McClemens, Sergeant 1st Class Sean McCloskey, Specialist Charles McClure, Sergeant Jason McCloskey, Sergeant Jonathan McCauley, Captain Daniel McCullum, Sergeant Andrew McConnell, Staff Sergeant McCullis McDaniel, Master Sergeant William McDaniel, Lance Corporal Joshua McDaniels, Sergeant Edmund McDonald, Staff Sergeant Jason McDonald, SFC David McDowell, Captain Mark McDowell, Second Lieutenant Michael McCannon, Specialist Clayton McGarra, Corporal Philip McGee, Specialist Robert McGee, Sergeant Thomas McGee, Staff Sergeant Timothy McGill, Lieutenant Michael McGreevy, Captain Nathan McHone, Colonel John McHugh, SFC Joseph McKay, Staff Sergeant Alan McKenna, Private 1st Class Buddy McLean, Sergeant Willie McLaughlin, Senior Petty Officer David McClendon, Sergeant Jason McLeod, SGM Jeffrey McLaughlin, Captain Jason McMahon, Lieutenant Colonel Michael McMahon, SFC Barrett McNabb, Staff Sergeant Sean McNabb, Specialist Andre McNair, Private 1st Class Spencer McNeil, Petty Officer 2nd Class Justin McNeely, Specialist Richard McNulty, Sergeant Jeremy McQueary, Sergeant John Meter, Private Coleman Meadows, Captain Joshua Meadows, Lance Corporal Dale Means, Private First Class Andrew Meary, Sergeant Preston Medley, Corporal Curtis Meir, Corporal Daniel McRear, Lance Corporal Jacob Miner, Lance Corporal Christopher Mice, First Sergeant Tobias Meister, Senior Staff Sergeant Luis Melendez Sanchez, Specialist Bradley Melton, Captain Jesse Melton, Staff Sergeant Joshua Melton, Staff Sergeant Casif Mimon, Lance Corporal Norberto Mendez, Specialist Hugo Mendoza, Sergeant Matthew Mendoza, First Sergeant Luke Mercardante, Private First Class William Meredith, Staff Sergeant Daniel Meriwether, Sergeant Jeffrey Mersman, Major Brian Mescal, Private First Class Michael Metcalf, Specialist Daniel Metcalf, SFC David Metzger, Staff Sergeant Jonathan Metzger, Seth Mihaud, Private First Class Devin McKell, Sergeant Donald Mickler, Corporal William Middleton, Corporal Anthony Mahalo, Petty Officer Second Class Charles Milam, Specialist Alexander Miller, Private First Class Cale Miller, SFC Daniel Miller, Private First Class David Miller, Specialist Harley Miller, Specialist James Miller, Petty Officer First Class Jerome Miller, Private First Class Mikkel Miller, Corporal Paul Miller, Staff Sergeant Robert Miller, Specialist Pedro Millette, First Lieutenant Scott Milley, Private First Class Errol Millard, Staff Sergeant Edward Mills, Lance Corporal Eugene Mills, Staff Sergeant Joshua Mills, Chief Petty Officer Stephen Mills, Private First Class Joseph Miracle, Petty Officer Third Class Dennis Miranda, Sergeant Garrett Missner, Specialist Gregory Missman, Captain David Mitchell, SFC Sean Mitchell, Staff Sergeant Sean Mittler, Specialist Kelly Mixon, Chief Warrant Officer Timothy Moling, Specialist Thomas Moffett, SFC Robert Moggensen, Sergeant Jacob Molina, Corporal Christopher Monahan, Sergeant Enrique Mondragon, Private First Class Jeremiah Monroe, Chief Warrant Officer Jose Montenegro, Lance Corporal Osprani Montes de Oca, Chief Warrant Officer Michael Montgomery, Staff Sergeant Thaddeus Montgomery, SFC Jared Monty, Private First Class Diego Montoya, Sergeant Alberto Mondrand, Sergeant William Moody, Major Evan Moldyke, Specialist Christopher Moon, Specialist Benjamin Moore, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Moore, Specialist Cody Mooseman, Private First Class Brian McQueen, Staff Sergeant Conrad Mora, Sergeant Samson Mora, Staff Sergeant Orlando Morales, Sergeant Raimundo Morales, Private First Class Gil Morales del Valle, Petty Officer Third Class Fabrico Moreno, Captain Jennifer Moreno, Second Lieutenant Travis Morgado, Staff Sergeant Dwight Morgan, Sergeant Darby Warren, SFC Jordan Morris, SFC Ramon Morris, SPC Donald Morrison, Sergeant Sonny Moses, Lieutenant Christopher Moscow, Staff Sergeant Sky Moti, Staff Sergeant Brian Maury, Staff Sergeant James Morris, Petty Officer 3rd Class David Mudge, Sergeant Nicholas Mueller, SPC Sean Mir, Sergeant Christopher Mullally, Corporal Scott Mullen, Warrant Officer Sean Mullen, Corporal Ian Muller, SPC Brandon Mullins, SPC William Mulvihill, Sergeant Rodrigo Mungravias, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Munier, Sergeant Christopher Muniz, SFC Pedro Munoz, SPC Thomas Murak, Private Michael Murdoch, Staff Sergeant Michael Murphy, Major Edward Murphy, Lieutenant Michael Murphy, SFC Dennis Murray, Sergeant Philip Myers, Sergeant Marlon Myrie, Specialist Scott Nagorski, Private First Class Dustin Napier, First Lieutenant Mohsen Nakbi, Lance Corporal Ryan Nas, Sergeant Juan Navarro, Corporal Benjamin Neal, Private First Class Robert Neer, Corporal Kenneth Nichokia, Private First Class Brandon Ninan, SPC Randy Neff, SPC Carlos Negron, Captain James Neal, Sergeant William Neal, Petty Officer First Class Caleb Nelson, SPC Joshua Nelson, Lance Corporal Travis Nelson, Sergeant Sapuro Nina, Staff Sergeant Eric Nettleton, Staff Sergeant Liam Nevins, Staff Sergeant Stephen New, Petty Officer Second Class Jared Newlove, Staff Sergeant Christopher Newman, Staff Sergeant Clinton Newman, Sergeant Eric Newman, Staff Sergeant Jamie Carlos, Private First Class Alan Newton, Captain Michael Newton, Lance Corporal Robert Newton, Private First Class Ton Ingo, Sergeant Long Nguyen, Corporal Tivon Nguyen, SFC Jamie Nicholas, Chief Warrant Officer Brian Nichols, SPC Donald Nichols, Sergeant Kenneth Nichols, SPC Rob Nichols, Sergeant Andrew Nickel, SPC Rafael Nieves, Captain Reed Nishizuga, Staff Sergeant Travis Nixon, Sergeant James Nolan, Corporal Michael Nolan, Private First Class Cody Norris, Sergeant Karen Nove, Private Adam Novak, Staff Sergeant David Nowazik, First Lieutenant Mark Noziska, Staff Sergeant Israel Nuanis, Chief Petty Officer Nicholas Knoll, SPC Levi Nuncio, SFC David Nunez, Staff Sergeant Joe Nunez Rodriguez, Private First Class Anthony Nunn, Captain Nathan Nylander, Petty Officer 3rd Class Matthew O'Brien, SPC Justin O'Donohue, Corporal Tanner O'Leary, Private First Class Evan O'Neill, SPC Jonathan O'Neill, Sergeant Michael O'Neill, SPC Joseph O'Quinn, Chief Warrant Officer Mark Osteen, Lance Corporal Nicholas O'Brien, Lance Corporal Sean O'Connor, Staff Sergeant Curtis Oakes, Sergeant Jasper Obeck Rarer, Private First Class Alberto Obad, Private First Class Alex Oseguera, Lance Corporal Alfonso Ochoa, SFC James Oshner, Major Henry Officier, Sergeant Justin Officer, Private First Class Matthew Ogden, Staff Sergeant Tony Olays, Lance Corporal Blaise Oleski, Corporal Nicholas Olivas, Staff Sergeant Jorge Oliveira, Sergeant Luis Oliver, Staff Sergeant Michael Olis, Lance Corporal Nigel Olson, Lance Corporal Javier Olvera, Lance Corporal Kevin Oratowski, SPC Tyler Orgard, Corpsman William Ortega, Staff Sergeant Javier Ortiz Rivera, Corporal Benjamin Osborne, Sergeant Kyle Osborne, SPC Jared Osborne, Lance Corporal Joshua Ose, Staff Sergeant Ergen Osman, Corporal Sean Osterman, Corporal Nicholas Ott, Petty Officer First Class Brian Olet, Corporal Michael Olet, Staff Sergeant Kirk Owen, Captain Bart Owens, SPC Brandon Owens, Sergeant Gregory Owens, Sergeant Vincent Owens, Captain Jesse Osbat, Captain Scott Pace, Sergeant Anthony Packey, Sergeant Timothy Paget, SPC Bobby Pagan, SPC James Page, Captain Joshua Parrish, Corporal Michael Palacio, SPC Ronnie Payares, Sergeant Mark Palmadier, Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Palmer, Private First Class Christopher Palmer, Sergeant Jason Palmerton, Sergeant Isaac Palomares, Staff Sergeant Kevin Pape, Staff Sergeant David Paquette, Corporal Nicholas Pereda Rodriguez, Sergeant Michael Paranzino, SPC Alejandro Pardo, Private First Class Benjamin Park, SFC Day Park, Christian Parker, Petty Officer First Class Vincent Parker, Sergeant Jason Parsons, First Lieutenant Tyler Parton, SFC Terrell Pasker, Sergeant Schuler Patch, Sergeant Ralph Earl Pate, Corporal Claudio Patino, Sergeant Daniel Patron, SPC Christopher Patterson, SPC Cody Patterson, SPC Adam Patton, Private First Class Michael Patton, Petty Officer Second Class Shane Patton, Staff Sergeant Robert Paul, Corporal Ronald Payne, Lance Corporal Adam Peak, Lance Corporal Brandon Pearson, Captain Andrew Pedersen Keel, Sergeant Brian Pedro, SPC John Pelham, SPC Justin Pellerin, Captain Paul Pena, Sergeant Roger Pena, SPC Pedro Pena Suarez, Sergeant Jonathan Peeney, Sergeant John Panique, Lance Corporal Richard Penny, Staff Sergeant Brandon Pepper, SPC Calvin Peretta, SPC Sergio Perez, Staff Sergeant Adam Perkins. SPC Adrian Perkins. Sergeant Theodore Perlow. Sergeant Dustin Perot. Sergeant Joseph Peters. Sergeant Anthony Peterson. SFC Daniel Petithori. Sergeant Jason Petto. Private First Class Jason Petrie. Private First Class Christopher Pfeiffer. SPC Joseph Benab. SFC Robert Ferris. Staff Sergeant Anton Phillips. Staff Sergeant Francis Phillips. Corporal Matthew Phillips. Sergeant Edward Philpott. Private First Class Brandon Pickering. Lance Corporal Noah Pierce. SPC Robert Pierce. Staff Sergeant Brian Piercy. Sergeant Linda Pierre. Private First Class David Petrick. Chief Petty Officer Christian Pike. SPC Jonathan Pilgrim. Captain Victoria Pinkney. SPC Trevor Pinnock. Staff Sergeant Christopher Piper. Sergeant James Pirtle. Petty Officer First Class Jesse Pittman. Lance Corporal Michael Plank. SPC Benjamin Plates. SRA Jason Flight. Major Stephen Plumoff. SPC Jared Plunk. Sergeant Alessandro Pluchino. Master Sergeant David Poirier. First Lieutenant William Poling. Master Sergeant James Ponder. Lance Corporal Timothy Poole. Ensign Jerry Pope. Corporal Jonathan Porto. Lance Corporal Gregory Posey. Private First Class Tony Potter. Petty Officer First Class Paris Powell. SPC Dennis Paulin. Staff Sergeant Alexander Pavlidis. Staff Sergeant Joshua Powell. Sergeant Joshua David Powell. SPC Matthew Powell. Staff Sergeant Benjamin Prange. First Lieutenant Stephen Prznicki. Chief Warrant Officer Clint Prather. SPC Dennis Pratt. Chief Warrant Officer John Pratt. Lance Corporal Kevin Preach. SPC Joseph Prentler. SPC Brandon Prescott. Private First Class Chisray Presley. Chief Warrant Officer Bruce Price. Master Sergeant Charles Price. Sergeant Daniel Price. Commander Job Price. Private First Class Michael Pridham. Sergeant McCall Prince. SPC David Proctor. Petty Officer Third Class Jason Profit. Staff Sergeant Brian Prosser. Master Sergeant Scott Pruitt. Staff Sergeant Matthew Puccino. Corporal Lucas Piat. SPC Michael Pyrone. Petty Officer Second Class Zin Key. Chief Warrant Officer John Quinlan. Sergeant Adam Quinn. Staff Sergeant Patrick Quinn. Staff Sergeant Daniel Quintana. Staff Sergeant Thomas Rabjohn. Sergeant Luther Rabone. SFC Jeffrey Rada Morales. First Sergeant Christopher Rafferty. Sergeant Barun Rai. Lieutenant Colonel Christopher Rabel. Corporal Pruitt Rainey. SPC Joel Ramirez. SPC Ray Ramirez. Chief Warrant Officer Talia Ramirez. Sergeant Louis Ramos Velasquez. SRA Jacob Ramsey. SPC Matthew Ramsey. Captain Wade Ramsey. Petty Officer Second Class Tony Randolph. Lance Corporal Daniel Rainey. Lance Corporal Christopher Rangel, Sergeant John Rankle, Major Charles Ransom, Sergeant Elijah Rayo, Sergeant Robert Rapp, SPC Bradley Rappoon, Chief Warrant Officer Derek Rasmussen, Corpsman Benjamin Rass, Staff Sergeant Joshua Rath, Senior Chief Petty Officer Thomas Ratzlaff, SPC Bryn Raver, First Lieutenant Ryan Rawl, Sergeant Adam Ray, First Lieutenant Clovis Ray, Staff Sergeant Joseph Randall, Private First Class Mariano Raimundo, Chief Warrant Officer Curtis Reagan, SPC Blaine Redding, Staff Sergeant Jerry Reed, SPC Jesse Reed, Staff Sergeant Jason Reeves, Senior Chief Petty Officer Robert James Reeves, Petty Officer First Class Chad Regelin, Major Stephen Reich, Staff Sergeant Nicholas Reed, Private First Class Shane Rafer, Corporal Zachary Reif, Staff Sergeant Job Rago, Staff Sergeant John Rainers, Corporal Kevin Reinhardt, Private First Class Robert Repke, Private First Class Juan Restrepo, Foreman Mark Retmier, Petty Officer First Class Thomas Retzer, Sergeant Jose Reyes, Sergeant Titus Reynolds, Lance Corporal Matthew Reza, SFC Trenton Rea, Private First Class Willington Rhodes, Private First Class Jeffrey Rice, Corporal Matthew Richard, Lance Corporal William Richards, Sergeant Jonathan Richardson, Sergeant Joseph Richardson, Sergeant Colby Richmond, Staff Sergeant William Ricketts, Master Sergeant Travis Riddick, Captain Charles Edward Wrigley, Staff Sergeant Juan Ridout, Master Sergeant Jeffrey Reich, SPC Brian Riley, SPC Joseph Riley, Sergeant Joshua Reimer, Private First Class Gustavo Rios Ordonez, Sergeant Michael Ristow, Staff Sergeant Juan Rivadeneira, Staff Sergeant Edwin Rivera, Sergeant Paul Rivera, Corporal Richard Rivera, SPC Daquan Rivers, Lance Corporal Thomas Rivers, Lance Corporal Tyler Rhodes, Corporal Jeffrey Robertson, Lance Corporal Cody Allen Roberts, Petty Officer Second Class Diane Roberts, SFC Edgar Roberts, Staff Sergeant Kevin Roberts, PC Michael Roberts, Petty Officer First Class Neil Roberts, SFC Forrest Robertson, Sergeant Nicholas Robertson, Private First Class Antion Robinson.
My name is Emily Kernitz. I'm a patriot, and I'm here to remember PFC Leonard J. Gozinski II. Staff Sergeant Carlo Robinson, Captain Charles Robinson, Sergeant First Class Christopher Robinson, Sergeant David Scott Robinson, Corporal Fernando Daniel Robinson, SCPO Keith Michael Robinson, Sergeant James Christopher Jr. Robinson, Sergeant Joshua James Robinson, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Allen Robinson, Sergeant Simone Asia Robinson, LCDR Thomas Lewis Robinson, Specialist Bobo Alexander Robelis Santa, Corporal Adrian Robelis, Lance Corporal Joseph Earl Rodwald, Lance Corporal Christopher Blake Rogers, Chief Warrant Officer 2 Joshua Robert Rogers. Staff Sergeant Christopher Dan Rogers. Sergeant Nelson D. Rodriguez Ramirez. Private First Class Arturo Emmanuel Rodriguez. Staff Sergeant Daniel Anthony Rodriguez. Sergeant First Class Gregory Allen Rodriguez. Sergeant Jose Rodriguez. Sergeant Mario Jr. Rodriguez. Lance Corporal Matthew Rolando Rodriguez. Major Rodolfo Ivan Rodriguez. Sergeant Rodolfo Jr. Rodriguez. Sergeant Ronald Ariel Rodriguez. Lance Corporal Omar Gregorian Robeck. Sergeant Jacob Lee Raleigh. Staff Sergeant Alan Lee Rogers. Staff Sergeant Jason Aaron Rogers. Private First Class Jesse Scott Rogers. Sergeant John Michael Rogers. Sergeant Justin Richard Rogers. Specialist Daniela Rojas. Sergeant First Class Daniel Aaron Romero. Specialist Christian Joseph Romig. Specialist Kyle Robert Rookie. Corporal Lester Gomez Roque. Lance Corporal Anthony James Rosa. Private First Class Adam Corey Ross. Lance Corporal Jacob Allen Ross. Corporal Justin David Ross. Sergeant Kenneth Grant Ross. Specialist Andrew J. Roughton. Staff Sergeant Larry Ismail Rogue. Corporal Nicholas Ryan Roche. First Sergeant Blue Charles Rowe. Sergeant Michael Curry Roy. Captain Nicholas John Rosansky. Staff Sergeant Keith Freeman Rudd. Staff Sergeant Christopher Michael Rosinski. Chief Warrant Officer 3 Matthew Paul Ruffner. Sergeant Cesar Bocanguera Ruiz. Sergeant Clinton Keith Ruiz. First Lieutenant John Marshall Jr. Runkle. Staff Sergeant Bruce Allen Jr. Rushforth. Private First Class Theodore Boykin Rushy. Private First Class Colton Wesley Rusk. Captain Drew E. Russell. First Lieutenant Honam Josue Russell. Sergeant First Class Michael Lynn Russell. Second Lieutenant David E. Rylander. Master Sergeant Roberto Jr. Sabalu. Sergeant Lucas Darius Sazek. Sergeant First Class Charles Montague Sadel. Sergeant Jose Luis Senias III. Specialist Brandon Neal Salazar. Private First Class Zachary Stephen Richard Salmon. Private First Class Junior Salvasian. A1C Jesse Monroe Samick. SRA Daniel Ray Sanchez. Sergeant Ian Thomas Sanchez. Sergeant Javier Jr. Sanchez. Sergeant Roberto Daniel Sanchez. Specialist Jeremiah Thor Sancho. Staff Sergeant Charles Ray Jr. Sanders. Private First Class Christian Riley St. Nicholas. Sergeant Annabelle Santiago Jr. Specialist Trinidad Santiago Jr. Sergeant Jason Anthony Santora. Corporal Dave Michael Moliski Santos. Sergeant Delphin Montemayor Santos Jr. First Lieutenant Timothy George Santos Jr. Specialist First Class Carlos Marceliano Santos Silva. Sergeant First Class Ryan James Savard. Sergeant First Class Ronald Wayne Sawyer. Sergeant Timothy Douglas Sane. Staff Sergeant Rex Lloyd Schad. Staff Sergeant Michael Wayne Schaefer. Chief Warrant Officer 4 Chris John Schurkenbach. Specialist Philip Channing Sipey Schiller. Lance Corporal Philip Wayne Schrimmel. Warrant Officer First Class Joseph Lee Shiro. Gunny Sergeant Justin Edward Schmalstig. Lance Corporal Benjamin Whetstone Schmidt. Staff Sergeant Jonathan Philip Schmidt. Corporal Kyle Richard Schneider. Corporal Richard Philip Schroner. SRA Julian C.G. Schulten. Staff Sergeant Mark Henry Schoenhoven. First Lieutenant Rosalind Littman Schultz. Captain Joseph William Schultz. Lance Corporal Nathaniel Joseph Augustus Schultz. Specialist Jordan Christopher Schumann. Sergeant Jacob Michael Schwally. Technical Sergeant Matthew Scott Schwartz. Staff Sergeant Mark Anthony Cialdo. Sergeant Drew Michael Scobie. Private First Class Bryce Merle Scott. Specialist Christopher John Scott. Sergeant Justin Andrew Scott. Lance Corporal Lucas Christopher Scott. Sergeant Michael Patrick Scusa. Sergeant Andrew Seabrooks. Specialist Joshua Michael Seals. A1C Matthew Ryan Seidler. Staff Sergeant Ricardo Seja. Sergeant Danton Kyle Sittinger. Staff Sergeant David Dwayne Self. Staff Sergeant David Paul Semt. SRA Adam Peter Cervase. Corporal Anthony Ramon Serban. Lance Corporal Timothy Giles Serwanski. Sergeant Dean Russell Schaefer. Sergeant Derek Lee Shanfield. Staff Sergeant Michael Allen Shank. Sergeant First Class Michael Paul David Shannon. Specialist Zachary Lee Shannon. Lance Corporal Charles South Sharp. Sergeant Ryan David Sharp. Sergeant First Class Christopher Donald Shaw. Staff Sergeant Eric Brian Shaw. Corporal Kurt Stephen Shea. Sergeant Jeffrey Chul Soon Shearer. Sergeant Benjamin William Sherman. Staff Sergeant Anissa Ann Sharrow. Private First Class Andrew John Shields. Specialist Justin Blue Shoecraft. Specialist Kevin Roger Shoemaker. First Sergeant Billy Joe Sirix. Sergeant Randolph Alonzo Sigley Jr. Staff Sergeant Brandon Mark Silk. Specialist Eduardo Sosa Silva. Chief Warrant Officer Second Class Joshua Benjamin Silverman. Lance Corporal San Sim. Private First Class Anthony Warren Simmons. Master Sergeant Sean Elliott Simmons. Corporal Derek Todd Simonetta. Sergeant Mark Allen Simpson. Staff Sergeant Michael Harrison Simpson. Private First Class Marky Tyrell Sims. Corporal Christopher Greg Singer. Corporal Gurpreet Singh. Private First Class Amy Renee Sinclair. Specialist Andrew Holland Sipple. Second Lieutenant Justin Lee Sisson. Sergeant Robert Curtis Sisson Jr. Corporal Christopher Franklin Sitton. Staff Sergeant Michael Stevens Sitton. Sergeant James Lynn Skalberg Jr. Specialist First Class Roberto Carlos Skelt. Captain Benjamin A. Sclaver. Specialist Wade Allen Slack. Chief Warrant Officer, 4th Class Michael Slobodnik. Corporal Antonio James Sled. Major Douglas Emery Sloan. Specialist First Class Matthew Stephen Slustiller. Private First Class Andrew Richard Small. Staff Sergeant Mark Joseph Small. Sergeant Aaron Michael Smith. PO2 Adam Olin Smith. SRA Bradley Randall Smith. Staff Sergeant David Casey Smith. Sergeant David James Smith. Staff Sergeant Edward Bernard Smith. Sergeant Garrick D. Smith. PO1 James Lee Smith. Sergeant Jason Thomas Smith. Staff Sergeant Jeremy Daniel Smith. Chief Warrant Officer 2 John Darren Smith. Staff Sergeant Paul Gene Smith. Sergeant Scott Daniel Smith. Sergeant Stefan Mark Smith. Specialist First Class Tara Jean Smith. Staff Sergeant Tyler James Smith. Lance Corporal Zachary Dillon Smith. Specialist D'Angelo Barnell Snow. Specialist Jesse Adams Snow. Staff Sergeant Alan Lee Snyder. Sergeant Devin Ariel Snyder. Specialist Norman Kyle Snyder. Corporal Stephen Cotty Soklowski. Sergeant Christopher Paul Soderland. Staff Sergeant Merrick Andrasic Soja. Technical Sergeant Christopher Michael Soulsby. Sergeant Diego Alberto Sorzano Valdovinos. Specialist Omar Soltero. Corporal David Michael Sanka. Private First Class Eric Daniel Sofring. First Lieutenant Jared Williams Southworth. Sergeant Tristan Howard Southworth. Lance Corporal Nicholas Joseph Sobey. Lance Corporal John Travis Sparks. Staff Sergeant Orion Nelson Sparks. Specialist Riley Sheridan Spalding. Sergeant First Class Christopher James Spear. PO2 Nicholas Patrick Separ. Gunny Sergeant David Shane Spicer. Staff Sergeant Ronald J. Spino. Sergeant Thomas Zachary Spitzer. Specialist Michael Keith Spivey. Private First Class Clinton Edward Springer II. Private First Class Tyler Michael Springman. Staff Sergeant Nicholas Adams Brosoff. Staff Sergeant Chris Neal Statz. Sergeant William Chapman Stacy. Lance Corporal James Bray Stack. Staff Sergeant Donald Vincent Stacy. Private First Class Austin Garrett Staggs. Specialist Cameron James Stombach. Corporal Jeffrey Robert Stanfest. Specialist Jared Donald Stanker. Sergeant Chase Brennan Stanley. Lance Corporal Cody Robert Stanley. Corporal Derek Anthony Stanley. CN Trevor Jovan Stanley. Specialist Michael Wayne Stanbury Jr. Corporal Jordan Robert Stanton. First Sergeant Tracy Lane Stapley. Specialist Christopher Glenn Stark. Sergeant Camilla Marchette Steely. Captain James Michael Steele. Captain Joshua Eric Steele. First Lieutenant Timothy James Steele. Specialist Brandon Keith Steffi. LTC John Henry Stein. Sergeant David Alexander Stevens. Sergeant First Class Riley Jean Stevens. Staff Sergeant Mark Allen Stutz Jr. Lance Corporal Stephen Prince Stevens II. Master Sergeant Benjamin Allen Stevenson. Staff Sergeant David Hamilton Stewart. Sergeant Patrick Dana Stewart. Corporal Matthew Paul Steyr. Sergeant Johnny Lee Stiles. Staff Sergeant Matthew Henrik Stilts. Corporal Jesse Wade Stites. Staff Sergeant Glenn Hale Stevenson Jr. Specialist First Class James John Stoddard Jr. Specialist Kyle Pascal Stolkalki. Master Sergeant John Thomas Stone. Private First Class Christopher Tiff Stonesifer. Staff Sergeant Christopher Todd Stout. Specialist Crystal Gay Stout. Sergeant Kyle Brandon Stout. Sergeant Michael Joseph Strachota. EO1 Michael Joseph Scrooge. Lieutenant Colonel Mark Edward Stratton II. Sergeant Scott Bradley Stream. Staff Sergeant Christopher Dwayne Strickland. PO3 Eichmann Antonio Strickland. Sergeant Joshua Jacob Strickland. Sergeant Charles Calvin Strong. Lance Corporal Jonathan Fulton Stroud. Corporal Sasha Struble. Staff Sergeant Scott Richard Stunman. Staff Sergeant Brian Edward Sutter. Corporal Gregory Scott Stoltz. Warrant Officer First Class Adrian Bobby Stubb. PFC Brandon Michael Steyer. Specialist Cody Dalton Suggs. Chief Warrant Officer Fourth Class Milton Eric Suggs. PO2 James Eric Sugg. CPO Sean Patrick Sullivan. Sergeant Jeremy Russell Summers. Sergeant First Class Severin West Summers III. Sergeant First Class Daniel Adrian Suppley. Private First Class Jake William Sutter. Specialist Preston James Sutter. Specialist First Class Billy Albert Sutton. Lance Corporal Stephen Jean Sutton. Sergeant Philip James Spickak. Lance Corporal Aaron Michael Swanson. Lance Corporal Justin James Swanson. Corporal Matthew Kalen Samuel Swanson. Staff Sergeant Paul Anthony Sweeney. Corporal Curtis Michael Swenson. Sergeant Jason Michael Swindle. PO3 James Michael Swink II. Specialist Pendleton Michael II Swink II. Specialist Pendleton Liddell II Sykes. CDR Adrian Basil Sweck. Specialist Brian Tabata. Specialist First Class Donald Throne Tab. Sergeant Christopher Maxwell Talbert. Specialist First Class Philip Cecil Tanner. PO1 David Martin Tapper. Lance Corporal Abraham Tarwo. AN Darren Ethan Tate. Corporal Jacob Allen Tate. Staff Sergeant Sheldon Leon Tate. CPO Michael Rex Tatum. Specialist Robert Joseph Todorus Jr. Sergeant Tofiga Joshua Totolo. Sergeant Ian Matthew Tawney. Staff Sergeant Aaron James Taylor. Staff Sergeant Archie Andrew Taylor. Staff Sergeant Cynthia Renee Taylor. Specialist David Wayne Taylor. Sergeant Dion Lamar Taylor. Sergeant First Class Houston Mark Taylor. PO1 Jeffrey Scott Taylor. Sergeant First Class John Edward Taylor. Corporal Jonathan Wesley Taylor. Lance Corporal Jonathan Andrew Taylor. Specialist Matthew Donald Taylor. Specialist Nicholas Andrew Taylor. Staff Sergeant John Michael Teal. Sergeant Zachary Daniel Tellier. Captain Eric Daniel Terhune. Lance Corporal Alec Robert Terweisk. Lance Corporal Justin Tyler Thacker. First Lieutenant Joseph James Tenner. Chief Warrant Officer Second Class Christopher Roy Thibodeau. Sergeant First Class James Errol Thode. Private First Class Adam Lee Thomas. CPO Colin Trent Thomas. Sergeant David William Thomas. Staff Sergeant Jesse Lamar Thomas Jr. Private First Class Christopher Douglas Scott Thomas. Sergeant First Class Matthew Bradford Thomas. Staff Sergeant Michael Dwayne Thomas. Staff Sergeant Robert Edward Thomas Jr. First Lieutenant Alejo Renee Thomas. Specialist Blair Daniel Thomas. Sergeant Daniel James Thompson. Captain David J. Thompson. Lance Corporal Jabari Nkosi Thompson. Private First Class Kevin Christopher Thompson. Staff Sergeant Joshua Adam Throckmorton. Staff Sergeant Richard James Tindon. Corporal Patrick Daniel Tillman. Sergeant Jesse Richard Tilton. Specialist David Nelson Timmons Jr. Captain John Tinsley. CDR Joel Del Mundo Tiu. Sergeant Andrew Robert Tobin. Specialist First Class David James Jr. Todd. First Lieutenant Jason Togi. PO1 Ross Laval Toles III. Sergeant Troy Orion Tom. Sergeant Joshua Abram Tomlinson. Staff Sergeant Travis Martin Tompkins. LTJG Francis Lawrence Toner IV. PFC Aaron Scott Topham. Corporal Eric Michael Torbert Jr. Master Sergeant Aaron Carl Torian. SPC Juan Manuel Torres. Sergeant Luis Ramon Torres. Chief Warrant Officer Third Class Eric William Totten. Lance Corporal Jacob Joseph Tobes. PFC John Jose Townsend. Staff Sergeant Joshua Ray Townsend. Specialist Cody James Toast. Sergeant William John Tracy. Sergeant James Matthews Trevor. Master Sergeant Gregory Ray Trent. Sergeant First Class Nelson David Trent. Private First Class Chad Michael Trimble. Staff Sergeant Eric Stanley Trueblood. PV1 Lamarl Jerome Tucker. Private First Class Stephen Charles Tucker. Chief Petty Officer John Thomas Tomlinson. Corporal Jacob Henry Turbot. Staff Sergeant Lyle Durbin Turnbull. First Sergeant Eddie Turner. Specialist Estelle Lee Turner. Private First Class Neil Isaac Turner. Sergeant Major Wardell Benjamin Turner. PO3 Emery Jason Turpin. Lance Corporal Benjamin Wade Tuttle. Lance Corporal Joshua Thomas Twig. Specialist First Class Peter Paul Tyke II. Private First Class Marcus Allen Times. HN Aaron David Ulam. Corporal Nicholas Kelly Uzinski. Corporal Angelo Joseph Vaccaro. Lance Corporal Stephen Armando Valdez. Master Sergeant Jared Neville Van Alst. Sergeant Alexander Van Alston. Sergeant Travis Allen Van Zoist. Staff Sergeant Gene Arden Vance Jr. Captain Kyle Rolf Van der Giesen. Corporal Joseph Andrew Van Drumelson. Staff Sergeant Kenneth Roland Van Giesen. Private First Class Jalfred David Corano. Specialist Anthony Vargas. Corporal Julio Vargas. Chief Warrant Officer Second Class Terry Lee Varnador II. Specialist First Class Gary Joseph Vasquez. Specialist Manuel Joseph Vasquez. Sergeant Daniel Mark Vesilin. Chief Petty Officer Aaron Carson Vaughn. Specialist Travis Ryan Vaughn. Lance Corporal Frederick Eric Vasquez. Staff Sergeant Jason Anthony Vasquez. Staff Sergeant Richard Lee Vasquez. PO2 Jorge Luis Velasquez. Specialist Andrew Velez. Specialist First Class Anthony Benitez Jr. Staff Sergeant Dane Taylor Benny. Lance Corporal Jared Cameron Burbett. Specialist Augustus James Bakari. Chief Petty Officer Craig Michael Kailani Vickers. Private First Class Barbara Vieira. Staff Sergeant William David Vile. Corporal Jorge Emmanuel Villasis. Private First Class Jonathan Michael Villanueva. Corporal Jorge Jr. Villarreal. SN Yeshibal Villancarcaso. Private First Class Timothy Ray Vamoto. Private First Class David Wayne Vincent. Lance Corporal Phila David Vinage. Staff Sergeant Alex Anthony Viola. Chief Warrant Officer Second Class Don Caetanto Beret. Specialist Robert Lee Wilkes Jr. Major Randall Dutton Boas. Major Paul Clark Wolaki. Sergeant First Class Lance Herman Bulgarer. Sergeant Demetrius Lamar Boyd. Specialist Jason Eric Von Cernek. Chief Warrant Officer Second Class Douglas M. Vos III. Captain Mark Tyler Voss. Specialist Andrew Paul Wade. Corporal Chad Stanford Wade. Sergeant Tristan McCall Wade. Private First Class Brandon James Wadman. Chief Warrant Officer Third Class Matthew Gabriel Wagstaff. Sergeant Brian Lloyd Walker. Major Jonathan Doyle Walker. First Lieutenant Laura Margaret Walker. Specialist Matthew Herbert Walker. Private First Class Morris Lewis Walker. Staff Sergeant Thomas Alva Walkup Jr. Sergeant Daniel Wayne Wallace. Sergeant David William Wallace III. Captain Ellery R. Wallace. Sergeant First Class Johnny Carl Walls. Sergeant Jonathan Michael Walls. First Lieutenant Jonathan Patrick Walsh. Specialist Sean Michael Walsh. Specialist Tyler Robert Walsh. TSG Howard Arlen Walters. Sergeant Zachary Joe Walters. LTC James Joseph Walton. Private First Class Christopher Ian Waltz. Staff Sergeant Christopher Michael Ward. Lance Corporal Eric Levy Ward. Sergeant Albert Dono Ware. Specialist Blake Daniel Whipple. Lance Corporal Andrew Francis Whitaker. Staff Sergeant Joshua Robert Whitaker. First Lieutenant Ashley Irene White. SRA Benjamin Daniel White. Private First Class James Paul White Jr. Specialist Jeffrey Lee White Jr. Specialist Joseph Valerie White. Chief Warrant Officer 3rd Class Kenneth Ryan White. Sergeant Kevin Wilson White. Private First Class Robert Charles White III. Staff Sergeant Robert Frank White. Lance Corporal Russell Patrick White. Corporal Joseph Charles Whitehead. Captain Nicholas Shade Whitlock. Private First Class Justin Michael Whitmer. Specialist Jeffrey Alexander Whitsitt. Captain Daniel Preston Whitten. Lance Corporal Joshua Ray Whittle. Sergeant Grant Arthur Wickman. Specialist James Taylor Wycliffe Chatchin. Sergeant Jeffrey Scott Weinkamp. Private First Class Matthew Everett Wilds. Specialist Robert Herbert Wildrick Jr. LTC James Leon Wiley Jr. Corporal Andrew Charles Wolfhart. Chief Warrant Officer the 3rd Class James Brian Wilk. First Lieutenant Justin James Wilkin. Sergeant Adam Alexander Wilkinson. Corporal Kyle Weston Wilkes. Captain Brian Douglas Willard. Corporal Anthony Lee Williams. Private First Class Charles Elvin Williams II. Specialist Clarence Williams III. Sergeant David Vincent Williams. Private First Class Dennis Michael Williams. First Lieutenant Derwin Isaac Williams. Sergeant Eric Edward Williams. Staff Sergeant Jesse Lee Williams. Private First Class Keith Michael Williams. Technical Sergeant Leslie Dominic Williams. Staff Sergeant Wesley Ross Williams. Sergeant Patrick Oliver Williamson. Sergeant Christopher M. Wilson. Lance Corporal Ivan Earl Wilson. Lance Corporal Justin J. Wilson. Private First Class Matthew Willard Wilson. PO1 Ryan James Wilson. Private First Class Shane Gregory Wilson. Private First Class Thomas Randolph Wilson. Sergeant Wade Daniel Wilson. Staff Sergeant William Robert Wilson III. Lance Corporal John Robert Mimpy Cagle. Staff Sergeant Jessica Marie Wing. Specialist Damon Gabriel Winkleman. PV2 Vincent Cortez Winston Jr. Sergeant Jeanette Lee Winters. Staff Sergeant Leston Michael Winters. SFC Benjamin Brian Weiss. Captain David Anthony Wisniewski. Sergeant Philip Lawrence Witowski. Lance Corporal Joshua Eli Witzman. Sergeant Aaron Xavier Whitman. Sergeant Jeremiah Thomas Whitman. Sergeant William Joseph Witowski. Sergeant Ed Uvis Guadalupe Wolf. Corporal Adam Franklin Wolf. Private First Class Brian Michael Wolverton. Private First Class Brett Everett Wood. Private First Class Edwin Copley Wood. Sergeant Roy Alvin Wood. PO3 Zarian Andre Wood. Staff Sergeant Romanus Lee Woodard. Corporal Travis Martin Woods. Sergeant First Class William Bryan Woods Jr. Sergeant Chris John Workman. Chief Petty Officer Jason Ray Workman. Sergeant Frank Joseph Alonzo World. Corporal Charles Jeffrey Wren. Specialist Christopher Shane Wright. First Lieutenant David Timothy Wright II. Sergeant Jeremy Robert Wright. Specialist Kyle James Wright. Lance Corporal Terry Carl Wright. Sergeant Joe Lee Wrightsman. Sergeant Christopher Matthew Winkle. Corporal Derek Allen Wyatt. Specialist Sterling William Wyatt. Sergeant Charles Edward Jr. Wyckoff. PFC Jacob Henry Christian. Staff Sergeant Nathan Lee Weirick. Lance Corporal Patrick Jr. Xavier. Corporal Nicholas George Ixaros. Private First Class Jonathan Christopher Yates. First Lieutenant Eric David Yates. Lance Corporal Alejandro J. Yazzie. SRA Jonathan Antonio Vega Yelner. Captain Roberto Jose Yeltzes. Chief Warrant Officer 2nd Class Jarrett Michael Yoder. Corporal James Chad Young. Master Sergeant Michael Wayne Young. Sergeant First Class Ricardo D'Andro Young. Captain Trevor John Urista, Sergeant Frank Riddell Zeringer III, Corporal Paul William Janowick II, Technical Sergeant Daniel Lee Zerby, First Lieutenant Andre Sermeno, Lieutenant Miroslav Steven Zilberman, First Lieutenant James Russell Zimmerman, Staff Sergeant Sonny Christopher Zimmerman, Specialist Daniel Zumbo, Corporal Gunner William Zoe.
All those names are just from one operation. Operation Enduring Freedom. All those names. Those names, they were sailors, soldiers, Marines, and airmen. All of them were a brother, a sister, a husband, a wife, a father, a mother, a son, or a daughter. As part of Operation Enduring Freedom, those people gave all. It hurts to think how many have lost their lives in the fight against these creatures. I don't even go to the extent of calling them animals, because even animals have a sense of decency to a degree. Many people think that freedom is free. They're born in America, so they're automatically free. They have all of these rights. It's just free. Freedom. Freedom is never free. It was fought for, bled for, died for. These men and women, they fought and died not only for this country, but also for each other. So, as we go into Memorial Day tomorrow, as we all go out and grill and get together with the family and our friends. I want I want you to look around. Look at all your friends. Look at all your family. If you're a parent, take a long look at your child. If your parents are there, look at them. Soak everything in. Because those few thousand names right there, they're only part of the massive number of men and women who have lost their lives since the founding of this nation. In the name of a constitutional republic, they have fought, bled, and died for. So again, enjoy your Memorial Day. Enjoy this holiday. Remember the true meaning behind it. Remember why you're celebrating it. Today is to is a day set to honor the fallen. Veterans Day will be on November 11th. Independence Day will be on July 4th. Tomorrow, the 28th of May, on a Monday, is Memorial Day. Tomorrow, I will continue this stream. And I will go into the names of those who lost their lives in Operation Iraqi Freedom. To all of you who heard a name of somebody you knew, whether it's a family member, a friend of a family member, or a friend of a friend, remember them. Don't ever forget their name.